lost pictures there. But let's bring you these live pictures from the House of Commons, where in the last hour, the Foreign Office Minister, Hamish Faulkner, has made a statement in the chamber following the government's decision to sanction two Israeli ministers in the Israeli government for their position on the war in Gaza.
I won't repeat my answers about the conference next week, but I just want to... my honourable friend has been committed to these issues for a long time, and she's absolutely right when she says that millions of people are in an abject position, facing famine, terrible shortages of all essential supplies, and they weigh very much on the mind of this government each and every day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The two Israeli ministers that the Minister has announced being sanctioned are no friends of the Israeli people or the Palestinians. And I have no truck with them, and nor should any of us. But the reality is, of course, that we have two aspects here. That is Hamas control still of Gaza and their refusal to release the hostages or to agree to a hostage exchange, or indeed to allow aid in and to allow that aid to reach the Palestinian people, as well as the challenge of releasing those hostages, as we all want to see happen. They've refused the ceasefire deal.
Well, Hamish Faulkner, the Home Office Minister, taking questions from MPs in the House of Commons. That is ongoing now. We'll, of course, bring you any updates. But let's have a listen first to what Hamish Faulkner said at the start of that statement.
The reality is that these human rights abuses, incitement to violence, extremist rhetoric, comes not just from an uncontrolled fringe, but from individuals who are ministers in this Israeli government. We must hold them to account and protect the viability of the two-state solution. So today we are sanctioning Bezalel, Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. We are acting alongside Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Norway, who have also announced their own measures today. These two men are responsible for inciting settler violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, violence which has led to the deaths of Palestinian civilians and the displacement of whole towns and villages. This violence constitutes an abuse of Palestinians' human rights.
Well, Hamish Faulkner there in the House of Commons will, of course, bring you any updates from the chamber. Liz Bates has been watching. I mean, it feels like a really significant moment. It feels like maybe we've seen a change of tone in the last week, but now we have action, not just words.
Exactly that, Ali. It does feel like a significant moment. It does feel like the government's language towards Israel has changed, but this is concrete action and it's quite confrontational action. This is the UK government for the first time ever sanctioning Israeli ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. The issue at hand, and Hamish Faulkner set this out in the House of Commons, is settler violence, and the accusation is that they have been inciting settler violence in the West Bank. Now, both of those ministers, I should say as well, the UK government says that they are being sanctioned in a personal capacity. I think what's becoming quite clear over the past few hours is the Israeli government considers this to be a collective confrontation from the UK government to Israel. So we will obviously be keeping an eye on the reaction to that. Both of these ministers have reacted. So let's hear what they have said in statements in a reaction to these sanctions.
These sanctions don't frighten me. Booze to the white paper. I will continue to work for our state, for our nation, and I will continue to work and ensure that humanitarian aid will not enter for Hamas. We have overcome Pharaoh, and we'll overcome this as well.
Britain has already tried once to prevent us from settling the cradle of our homeland, and we will not allow them to do so again. We are determined, with God's help, to continue and to build.
So, yeah, look, I mean, robust responses from both those ministers.
Certainly, and I think what was quite interesting in both of those responses is references to the White Paper. This is a reference way back to the formation of the Israeli state and Britain's role in that. And what both of these ministers are saying is Britain, at one point in history, was telling the Israeli people where they could live in this area and saying that they could limit the amount of Jewish people moving to that area. What these two ministers are saying is is that time has passed. We are an independent nation. We will decide where we live. So they see this as a sort of historic struggle. That's quite clear. I think there's some key takeaways from what we have seen today. First of all is the UK's position has changed so much when you think back to the aftermath of that horrendous Hamas attack. The Israeli flag was projected onto Downing Street. Keir Starmer, before he was Prime Minister, when he was asked about Israel's actions in Gaza, said Israel has the right to defend itself, and got himself into quite a lot of trouble, saying that quite clearly the position has changed so much over the past couple of years that we've got to this point where Israeli ministers are being sanctioned. The other thing is the diversion from the US. This is action that has been taken alongside Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Norway, the US not sanctioning ministers. We haven't heard from the White House yet, but it will be interesting to see their response. And finally, lots of MPs, including Labour MPs, would actually like to see the government go further on this. They would like to see more sanctions. They would like to see action on aid, on arms sales. So the government, this is certainly a stepping up in terms of their approach to Israel, but there will still be pressure for them to do more.
And I think we have a statement that we've had in the last couple of hours from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, is that right? We have. And a lot of what was said by those two ministers that we've just heard has been echoed in this statement. The first line, quite interesting, the British mandate over Israel ended in May 1948. It will never return. That is saying, Britain, leave us alone. We decide what we do. Let me bring you another piece of it here. Israel is a sovereign, independent and proud state fighting a historic battle for its existence against a regional axis working to destroy it. Israel will emerge from this battle with the upper hand, first and foremost, because it has no other choice. That's the Israeli foreign minister. The final line in this, early next week, he says, we will hold a government debate in which we will decide on our response to the decisions taken against the ministers. So, as I said before, clearly, Israel does not consider this to be sanctions personally against these two ministers. They are taking this as a collective confrontation from the UK government against them. And they will decide early next week what their response will be. Could they sanction UK ministers? I mean, it would be interesting to see what they decide to do. OK, Liz Bates, our political correspondent, who's been following everything that's been going on in the Commons. As I say, we will bring you any updates as and when we get them. Thank you so much, Liz Bates. So we've seen the words in the Commons. We've seen a significant UK response today to the situation in Gaza. And it feels like a moment that we might well look back on as what could be a turning point. The Prime Minister so far has been determined not to speak out of turn. He's been incredibly careful with his words, as recently as this morning.
We are, in answer to your question, talking to other partners about what more we can do, including questions of sanctions. My strong belief is when we make a move, if we're able to do that in company of other countries, that's a stronger move than doing it on our own. So that's the basic approach that we're taking, but we are working on what more we can do in the pretty short term now.
But in the last week, we have seen a change in tone. Senior ministers willing to condemn Israel in a way that they haven't before.
Israel's newly introduced measures for aid delivery are inhumane, foster desperation, and endanger civilians. Israel's unjustified block on aid into Gaza needs to end. It is inhumane.
The scale of loss of civilian life, the attack on humanitarian aid workers that we've seen, the destruction of civilian facilities, including hospitals, has been a horror show, frankly.
I mean, the government has been treading a tightrope with Israel on one side, Gaza on the other. Today, they've undoubtedly tipped one way, not just words, but action on Israel.
Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have been inciting violence against Palestinian people for months and months and months. They have been encouraging egregious abuses of human rights. We have been raising this with the Israeli government, both privately and publicly.
It is a big deal. Two senior Israeli ministers banned from entering the UK, their assets frozen. That's the sort of action usually reserved for authoritarian regimes, for politicians, countries like Russia and North Korea. It also shows that this is a government that is perhaps willing to risk fracturing relations, not just with Israel, but potentially the US too. Now, as you can see, we've got our panel with us for this evening. The former Conservative Special Advisor James Starkey and SNP Chief Whip in Westminster, Kirsty Blackman. Thank you both. Liz is still here as well. But first, let's come to you two. Kirsty, what was your reaction to the news today?
I mean, we've been clear all along that the government needs to do more. I think that it has taken action today, and I'm glad that it's taken action, but it's taken action about what's been said and what's been done and the settlers that are happening in the West Bank, not where we're seeing the issues with the aid delivery in Gaza, with the humanitarian aid agency that's supposed to be delivering aid, not where we're seeing the hospitals and schools being bombed. Two different geographical locations. It absolutely is in relation to Israel, but actually, they're not taking action about what's being said and done in Gaza. I think there's more they could do. I think they could stop the F-35s being sold. I think they could stop any of the 352 licences they currently have for exporting goods to Israel. 160 of those go in relation to military equipment. I mean, clearly the UK government is still providing arms to Israel, and we're seeing the situation in Gaza. We know the situation in the West Bank is really terrible. The situation in Gaza is worse, and the UK could do more.
James, do you agree with that?
I think as Liz laid out, this is the toughest action the UK government has taken yet, and we've seen a kind of gradual, but now feels like quite a big step forward. And the really interesting thing to watch overnight and in the next few days, I think, will be the response of the White House. Because ultimately, if there's going to be any change in the Israeli government stance, Netanyahu's stance, it's almost certainly going to be coming from pressure from Trump and the White House, not from leaders elsewhere. So this pressure can obviously assist that, but the thing to watch is what is the White House's response to this, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, we're at odds with the US when it comes to this move, but we're following Canada, New Zealand. Are we showing leadership? Are we leading the way, or are we?
I'm glad that collective action has been taken. I'm glad that the UK has been talking to international partners about this and has acted in concert with them. I do genuinely still think that there's more that we could do. You saw Hamish Falconer there talking about how horrific the situation is in Gaza. There is more that the UK government could do. It's refusing to take action around the F-35s. It's refusing to properly assess whether or not there's genocide, despite, making really contrary statements about this, saying both, we can't assess genocide, that needs to be done by the courts, and also we agree that there's no genocide. We need to be there preventing the genocide and doing what we can, and stopping the F-35s, I think, the export of that stuff, would be a really good step.
As Liz was saying, it's incredible to think how much the tone has changed since those terrible attacks by Hamas on October 7th, since we had the flag of Israel projected on Downing Street. I mean, how do you think the Conservatives have done? Your old boss, Priti Patel, was in the chamber today. Do you think they've got the right line on this?
I think it's a difficult line. I mean, I think I've got a lot of sympathy, actually, for the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary on this. They're balancing a whole range of issues. So there's a huge pressure internally in the Labour Party and in Parliament to do more on certain aspects. But as I said, they've got to balance that between what's going to deliver real change. Because if their focus is on how can we get aid into Gaza, how can we get even a short-term ceasefire, then you can't play party politics with that. And that's a difficult place for him to be in. And I actually think the opposition parties, both when Labour were in opposition and the Conservatives now on this issue, and the SNP, I think broadly you're seeing a constructive argument in Parliament, because it's not an area where playing politics is going to get you anywhere. It's not going to.
It did feel last week, particularly, that almost everybody in Parliament, almost all of the MPs, cross-party, were saying the UK government needs to step up and do more. So maybe that's a reaction to that strength of feeling there was
feels like a bit of
in the House of Commons.
A sea change.
It does, yeah. Even from the Conservatives.
Did you sense that from what you saw in Parliament this afternoon?
Yes, certainly. And I would reflect what both of your panellists have said rightly, which is that it felt like a moment of quietness, civility, people were listening, there was no party politics being played out. I think the interesting thing, as you mentioned a couple of times, Ali, about the UK government and UK political, the way that things have changed, I think one of the things that we are seeing that's very different from lots of historical wars is we see the images. day in, day out of starving children in Gaza. And I think that is really heaping public pressure on the government. It's putting pressure on Parliament. MPs want to see things happening with a real sense of urgency. And I think that is the position that the government is in.
OK, Liz Bates and our panel, James and Kirsty, thanks so much to all three of you for that. Now, back to the UK, with the looming spending review, the Chancellor will take her feet in the Commons tomorrow and deliver this Labour government's first spending review, setting out the budgets for government departments until 2030. Rachel Reeves has already U-turned, as I'm sure you'll know, on removing winter fuel payments from all but the poorest pensioners. Also, on that side of the ledger, she is pledging to hike defence spending, invest $86 billion in science and technology and give free school meals to 500,000 more children. The focus tomorrow will turn to how she's going to pay for it all. Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby, reports on the trade-offs that are facing the Chancellor.
Rewiring Britain. The PM in East Anglia today to give these students some good news.
OK, so far so good. So far so good, yes.
A massive money injection for a new nuclear power plant where they live in Suffolk.
This is about good, well-paid, secure jobs, skilled jobs across a range of topics as we go down this road in relation to Sizewell.
This is a big investment, £14.2 billion to develop Sizewell C, with more than 10,000 jobs to be created over the next decade. All part of a capital spending blitz, the government borrowing tens of billions to invest in power stations, rail and tram networks, scientific research up and down the country. The message: the government will invest to renew Britain. But in all of this, a health warning. When it comes to day-to-day spending on public services, a squeeze is coming as the government prioritises NHS and defence spending, with the Home Office and local government among departments losing out.
It really brings together
Questions then around whether Labour will meet manifesto promises, be it on housing and policing. Questions too on whether the government will stick with other plans after buckling over winter fuel allowance cuts. Can you just be honest about winter fuel allowance, that you reversed it because of poor local election results, you realised it was really unpopular, and you listened to voters? That is the truth, isn't it?
Well, of course we listen to voters all of the time. That's part and parcel of being a politician. The first question is, did we make the right decision in the first place? I believe we did, because we needed to stabilise the economy. I wanted to look to see whether we could have more pensioners eligible for this winter. I announced that some weeks ago.
You realised you got it wrong?
No, we had to. I could have pretended in the budget that there wasn't a £22 billion black hole. I wasn't prepared to do that.
So you're reversing a tax-raising measure, and now all the talk is you're going to have to raise taxes.
Everybody understandably challenges me to say you're going to put tax up. We didn't do it in the spring statement, notwithstanding most people saying you're going to. Equally, I don't think the first lever that a government should go to is the tax lever.
This spending review is a massive moment, and it's not just about the sums of money involved, massive though they are. It's also a massive moment for a Prime Minister who's had a tough first year and now wants to turn the corner and show you, the voters, that he can deliver the change you voted for when he was elected. That's the plan, but in practice, it's all rather difficult. The economic outlook is uncertain, and this Prime Minister is under acute pressure from his MPs and voters too, not to cut spending. That's what the winter fuel allowance reversal shows. And so in the coming months, he's going to be under even more pressure to raise taxes again. This is not a moment to decide tax rises. That all happens in the budget in the autumn. But this spending review is a moment that will define Labour in power and how our country looks and feels for years to come. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Beth Rigby there. Well, ahead of tomorrow's spending review, the Energy Secretary has vowed the UK is about to enter a golden age of nuclear. The government says that 10,000 jobs will be created in a £14 billion investment to build Sizewell C nuclear plant. Well, earlier I spoke to the Energy Minister, Michael Shanks. Michael Shanks, thank you so much for talking to us on the Politics Hub. You're not the first energy minister to talk about a golden age of nuclear power. That's obviously the big thing you want to talk about today. How much is it all going to cost?
Well, I think the big difference, though, is that we've put money on the table today. So we've said we're going to commit to Sizewell C and the next generation of small modular reactors. So we've committed to that. Look, the final cost figures are obviously, we'll work out as the project goes forward, but we've committed to saying nuclear plays a critical role in our energy mix. And for decades, we've had dither and distraction from successive governments, frankly. Nuclear used to play a critical role in across the UK's energy mix. It hasn't been for decades. We want to see that back again. That's what we've announced today.
I guess the thing is, you know, as we've seen previously in Hinkley, these costs do escalate. Can you guarantee to people that that's not going to happen here?
Well, I think the really important thing about Sizewell C compared to Hinkley is that it's an exact duplicate of Hinkley Point C. So we've learned a lot about how that was built, but also the supply chains, the skilled workers, all of that transfers into Sizewell C with cost savings as a result of that. Hinkley Point C also had to contend with things like COVID and everything else. So, look, we're determined that this project will be delivered on budget. We've said very clearly that this is important not just for our energy mix, but for the thousands of skilled jobs that go with it. 10,000 people will be employed in Sizewell C at the height of its construction. That's a really important economic opportunity for the country as well.
I guess the thing is, you know, governments don't intentionally overspend. How can you be sure that is not going to happen? In Hinkley, we saw the EDF estimate was £46 billion. That was an increase of about a third when you include inflation. Now, how can you be sure that that is not going to happen now?
Well, I think that, as I said, the really interesting thing about Sizewell C is that we're building an exact duplicate of Hinkley Point C. So all of those questions about increased costs, but also some of the supply chain costs that increased, all of that is much easier because we're building the same thing twice. So, look, I think we've learned a lot from that. We're determined to deliver it on budget. But it is really important to say the role that nuclear plays in our energy...
So you can guarantee right now it's not going to go over budget?
Well, look, I'm saying right now we'll do everything we possibly can to keep it within budget. Of course we will. But the role that nuclear plays in our energy mix is critically important. We're building a clean power system by 2030. That's about solar, it's about wind, but nuclear plays a really important role as well.
When are people going to start to see a difference in their energy bills? This is obviously a long-term plan.
Well, the energy bills have come down, not by nearly enough. We will do much more to make sure that continues to come down. But all of what we're building in our clean power mission... When, though? Well, I mean, bills will start to come down the more we push gas off the system. So gas is the price setter 80% of the time at the moment. It's subject to the volatility of fossil fuel markets set internationally. Every wind turbine we put up, every solar panel we switch on, and every megawatt we generate in new nuclear will push gas off the system and protect bill payers in the long term.
OK, I want to ask you a little bit about the situation in Israel, because we've had some pretty significant news today. Sanctions on 2 senior Israeli ministers. We don't often see this, you know, usually it's authoritarian regimes where we see politicians facing these sorts of sanctions. These people are going to be banned from the UK. What message are you hoping to send with this?
Well, the message is what we've been saying throughout, that the increase in settlements in the West Bank has to stop. We've been very clear on that, and the violence that goes with it must stop. The government's been working behind the scenes to try and stop that, but also to deliver a ceasefire in Gaza. But this decision today is around saying we will not tolerate that. And we're working with international partners. It's not just us that have sanctioned these 2 Israeli ministers, other governments have as well. It's an important statement that the violence in the settlements in the West Bank has to stop.
The United States hasn't, though.
Well, every country will make its own decisions around what they choose to do. We're working with allies, and we've made this decision today. The Minister for the Middle East has also met with the Israeli ambassador. It's a series of steps that we're taking to underline our position, which is to say, you know, we will continue to support the right of Israel to defend itself, but that has to be within international law, and the settlements in the West Bank should not be continued to be expanded by Israeli settlements, which we have seen over the past few years. That has to stop.
And I guess is what we're seeing a willingness to see a fracturing of relations with not just Israel, but potentially the US as well?
Well, no, look, I think this is a very specific decision today around 2 Israeli ministers in a personal capacity that have been sanctioned. It's a clear statement from us that that behaviour won't be tolerated and that the UK government wants to take it seriously. We obviously keep further sanctions under review. We don't have a running commentary on that. But all of this is part of an effort across the UK government to try and bring to an end the violence that we're seeing in the West Bank, but also, of course, to deliver a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza and the work towards a 2-state solution.
OK, thank you so much for talking to us on the Politics Hub. Right, let's bring James and Kirsty back in to talk about the spending review. I mean, the build-up's been real from my perspective. We've been talking about it a lot. There's the eve before the spending review. We're hearing a lot about the kind of sugar rush in terms of capital spending, but there are going to be squeezes on day-to-day spending, right, James?
And I think that's exactly why you've had the build-up. We've had a lot of leaks in the past few days about where they're spending money. And I think some of them are to be welcomed, like the SMR investment and so on. In the longer term, it's good to see that. But I think the reason why Labour are doing it is because they know they know full well that there's going to be cuts coming. So they're trying to shape the narrative going into the spending review and saying, hey, here are all these winners, we're going to have all this investment, knowing that probably a lot of the trail coming out and that people like Kirsty will point out when it does come out is cuts across various departments, local government, etc.
And it is all about storytelling, isn't it, Kirsty? Do you think they've managed to tell a story?
I mean, it is, but, some of the stuff that they're talking about this new nuclear plant that, for a start, is going to increase people's energy bills now or soon, because we're all going to be paying for it as bill payers. It's not going to deliver for a decade before it's built. 14 billion is being put into this, but actually it doesn't make a difference to people's lives now. And given that Labour came in saying that they were going to tackle child poverty, they've pushed their child poverty task force strategy announcements back into the autumn now. They've not tackled the two-child cap. They've had to do this U-turn in relation to winter fuel payment. They're looking still to make massive cuts to disability benefits. I mean, there's an awful lot of negative stories that we could tell about what's currently happening. I don't know what they've got left to say tomorrow, given that they've made all of these announcements about things like Sizewell. What I'm hoping we will see tomorrow is Acorn Carbon Capture and Storage, which is Scotland's carbon capture and storage project. I would like to see the government commit money to that. We've been pushing for that for a very long time. I first dealt with Acorn nearly a decade ago. I'm hoping that we will see that. I'm hoping that we'll see the cancellation of the two-child cap. I would love to see them match the Scottish child payment that is bringing children out of poverty in Scotland. I don't think they will, but we will keep pressing them to do that, just to try and make a difference to people's daily lives now.
I guess it's just a question of patience as well, James. All this capital spending, as you say, it's going to take a lot of time to see the trade links working between Liverpool and Manchester, to see Sizewell C actually delivering benefits. Have the public run out of patience after years and years of gloomy economic news?
I think the patience of the public is thin. It's shorter attention span, 24-hour media and so on. I think one of the issues is Labour promised a lot.
Yes.
So on the one hand, promising huge investment, but on the other hand, promising services are going to get better. There's a tension there. And I think the biggest tension is something that we haven't but may touch on, is the central mission of government, of this government as they've laid out, and is the thing that's going to, I think, define them, is growth. So in 4 years' time, if they don't get growth in the economy, they won't have the tax receipts in to keep investing in public services and deliver any tax cuts ahead of an election. And the question is, we've seen the winter fuel yesterday, there's pressure on the two-child benefit cap, as Kirsty mentioned. Now, in and of themselves, they're policies that people would say would make a difference to people's lives, and you understand that, but they said they would make difficult decisions. And that money has to come from somewhere, and the question is going to be, is it going to come from tax increases later in the year?
Where does the SNP think that money should come from?
I mean, I think actually talking about growing the economy is really important. I think that mission of growth is really key.
What if you don't get growth?
If you don't get growth, well, for a start, you could not spend money on new nuclear submarines. You could not spend money on Sizewell C and new nuclear power plants. I would be looking at doing things like, the way the UK government is approaching energy just baffles me. We're going to lose 400 jobs a fortnight in offshore energy, right? 400 incredibly highly paid, good jobs, because the UK government's unwilling to take this seriously. That's not going to create growth. That is going to create real issues for our economy if we see the loss of those jobs, and we need government action.
How likely do you think it is that we're going to get growth?
Well,
tricky question, James.
If I could answer that question, I'd be much richer than I am.
It doesn't look too promising from some sides.
I think it's tricky. I think we're seeing the difficulties now that Labour have got, which is that they've spent in the past few weeks, I would say, circa £5 billion on, if you include the potential two-child benefit cap, which people expect they'll do, in the past few weeks, of money they don't really have. They only had 10 billion in fiscal headroom. So that's a huge amount of money already they've got just to make up That's without cutting any taxes or anything like that. And we saw the reaction to the last budget amongst business. They've had slightly more positive economic news in the last couple of months, but the long term has been downgraded, so it's challenging.
OK, thank you both. We will come back to you. Lots more to talk about. The spending review is, I'm sure, going to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview as usual from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the political journalist and broadcaster Theo Usherwood and journalist and broadcaster Sonia Shoda. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up. They've picked the wrong fight on winter fuel. The verdict from a man who sat where Rachel Reeves is sitting right now. Former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is next. Hello, welcome back. Well, let's stay with tomorrow's big spending review, shall we? Sky's data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has been crunching the numbers.
It's the spending review, a big moment for the government and for the rest of us, because we get a sense of where it's planning to spend money, our money, and it's quite a lot of it. Let's look at the big picture, OK? So this is showing you how much money the government brings in terms of taxes. So that's money that we spend, we pay in taxes, and how much it spends. So 1.35 trillion versus 1.23 trillion. You've probably noticed a difference here. Look, this bar spending is higher than that bar. The difference between them, that's the borrowing. So we talk about that a lot, don't we, in budgets, about how much extra borrowing there is in order to make those two lines add up. This time around, it's less about that, less about taxes, less about borrowing, it's more about spending. And it's not the whole lot of this. This is quite an important distinction here. So a large chunk of this spending is actually, it's known as annually managed expenditure. It's not really, I mean, it's a bit of a strange name for it, because that's things like benefits, it's pensions, it's debt interest, it's the stuff that is harder to control on a day-to-day or a year-to-year basis. Instead, the focus in the spending review is not about that, it's about this. It's about departmental spending, £554 billion worth of it. And we can also kind of break that down a little bit as well, because some of the spending goes into day-to-day stuff, so paying, for instance, for nurses' wages. Some of it is investment, so spending on hospitals, actually building things. And that breakdown matters, OK, because you have to look at those things differently. They've got different effect. And if we take that current spending, a lot of what we're going to hear about here, it's not just about totals. It's more about how that money is divided up between different departments. So right now, this year, here is how day-to-day spending is divided up. You've got health there. You can see that by far and away the biggest line is health. But you've got education, you've got intelligence and defence. The big question this time around is, how much do those bars go up? We've heard a lot about more money for health. We've heard a lot about more money for defence. But how does it change the overall balance of spending? And then there's the big picture, OK? And this matters as well, OK? Because it's that question about whether the government is increasing the overall amount of spending all that much. This is showing you day-to-day spending going back to 2006-07, investment as well, that's the red line, and it's inflation adjusted. And there's one thing that this government want to highlight a lot, which is that the Conservatives were planning for those lines to be basically flat, actually a little bit falling when it comes to investments. That this government is planning to increase them considerably. So look at just how those dotted lines go up by more. But there's a big proviso to this, OK? If you take that same data and don't just inflation adjust it, but divide it by a share of GDP, which is kind of what you should do when you're comparing it over a long period like that. Same data, divided by GDP, and it's a very different picture, OK? So look at this black line, OK? That, you can see, so you can see the big picture here. That's austerity, how that line went down. Spending was cut over that period, day-to-day spending. There's COVID there. But what you can also make out is, look, even at the peak of where we're heading in the next few years, that is still going to be below the pre-2014 levels. So it's not austerity, it's not coming down, but it's still not getting you back to that pre-austerity level. However, when it comes to investment, look at this line. It's hard to make out here, but actually, that is heading to the highest level for decades. So doubtless, that investment, all those spending plans, building stuff, that is going to be the main thing that Rachel Reeves wants to focus on.
Well, tomorrow, as Ed was explaining, the Chancellor is going to reveal how much money is going to be allocated for the various government departments. So who better to speak to than the man who's seen both sides of the process? So Jeremy Hunt, the former Chancellor, Foreign Secretary and Health Secretary. Jeremy Hunt, former Chancellor, thank you so much for talking to us today. Let's start with the spending review, because you've been in quite a unique position, haven't you, where you've been both on the side of being a Secretary of State asking for money and also on the side of being Chancellor telling people there is no money left. But do you have a bit of sympathy for Rachel Reeves?
I do. I mean, you are everyone's worst enemy inside government, because you've got this spending envelope, as it's called, and you're trying to reach that number. You have to reach that number. And everyone tries every trick in the book. If it's the Home Secretary, you get police officers writing in. If it's the Defence Secretary, it's generals and admirals and, all the lobby groups. So you are under a lot of pressure. That said, it's your job. And I think what we're all going to be looking at today is Rachel Reeves going to take the difficult decisions that mean we avoid taxes going up in the autumn or not? Because
what difficult decisions are they?
Well, I've looked at this quite carefully, and I think the only area where she could really take difficult decisions that would be good for the economy, good for the country, but difficult for the Labour Party is welfare reform, because since the pandemic, our welfare budget has got totally out of control. We're signing off about 80,000 people a year. We're saying not just they don't have to work, but they don't even have to look for work. That's terrible for the individuals involved. It's bad for the economy, but it also costs a fortune to taxpayers. So that's
That is something this government are focusing on. They're cutting the welfare bill significantly.
Well, they're not actually. I mean, they've introduced some measures. The winter fuel thing, they've done a big U-turn on. They're apparently going to change the two-child cap, which would be, I think, an insult to people who work really hard and pay their taxes and have to, bear the costs of having large families. So I'm a bit worried about some of the noises we're hearing on welfare reform. But I think in her heart, Rachel Reeves actually wants to do the right thing on this. And I just hope she gets the backing from Keir Starmer and Number 10, because another autumn budget of tax rises would be absolutely catastrophic for business throughout the economy, and really no one wants to see that.
Just on winter fuel there, so where do you think the threshold should be?
Well, my feeling is that, there are lots of reasons why we shouldn't be paying a winter fuel payment to wealthy pensioners. But the whole measure only saved, before the U-turn, just over £1 billion. And we've used up so much capital in the process of doing it that I think it's making the government very nervous about what we should really be doing, which is reducing the overall working age benefit bill to pre-pandemic levels, which saves about £50 billion a year. And so I just worry they picked the wrong fight.
But you think the U-turn was the right decision, by the sounds of it, politically?
Politically, I think they will probably end up losing both ways, because I don't think you get credit for doing a U-turn. But my real problem is that, welfare reform is such an important thing, and I think this is going to make them very nervous about taking the bold decisions that actually need to be taken.
Do you think pensioners are kind of an untouchable part of the electorate?
No, I think that everyone has to, bear their share of the pressures. But I do think it's reasonable to say that...
Are pensioners bearing their share of the pressures, do you think?
Well, I think it's reasonable. I always felt as Chancellor that it's reasonable to treat pensioners differently, because they don't have the capacity that you and I have to go out and earn more money. They've come to a stage in their life where they've paid taxes throughout their working lives, and they're retired. So they are in a different situation to everyone else. So I think it's fair to recognise that. But I also think it's fair to say that, everyone has to bear some of the pressure.
Is it fair that, pensioners can vote and children can't vote? And there have been, Gordon Brown talks about austerity children born after 2010 impacted by the austerity years when you and the Conservatives were in government. Do you think that's fair?
Well, what happened in that period? The number of children in absolute poverty went down by 200,000, despite all those measures that were criticised as austerity. Why is that? Because we got 4 million more jobs in the economy, and work is the best route out of poverty. At the same time, state school standards rose to the highest in Western Europe. So I am absolutely in favour of doing the long-term things that create a better future for our children. But the one thing those children don't want is an economy that isn't growing, isn't creating jobs, because it's been overburdened with taxes. And that's the risk that we're in now, a kind of doom loop of ever higher taxes and ever lower growth.
Has Rachel Reeves ever asked you for advice?
I wouldn't describe it like that, but we have a perfectly friendly relationship by WhatsApp, and we exchange messages.
Recently?
Every night. Yeah, quite recently. We exchange messages. Look, I think politics is a brutal sport, but if you can preserve
Do you think you've
personal...
helped her a bit?
I wouldn't say that, but, if you can preserve the personal relationships behind the hurly-burly, I think that's a good thing.
I do want to talk to you about the NHS. Obviously, this is all linked to the spending review. We know a lot of money going towards the NHS. When you held on to your seat in Godalming, you said that you hope Labour will use its majority to make much-needed reforms to the NHS in a way that is sometimes difficult for Conservative governments to do. Are you happy with what you've seen on that so far?
I'd like to see more. When Conservatives make changes to the NHS, everyone always screams that we're trying to privatise it. We never are, but that's the cry. That's what makes it hard for my party. Labour doesn't get that charge, and so they can make some very big long-term changes. I think, what the NHS stands for, free healthcare for everyone who needs it, bloody brilliant. In practice, it is on its knees at the moment after the pandemic. It hasn't really recovered. And what we need to do is big reforms that stop it being such a centralised, bureaucratic system that mean that there are just hundreds of targets in every part of the system. Nowhere else in the world tries to run the NHS like the way we do. And what we just need to do is to make it much more local, much more flexible, get rid of the targets, like we did, for example, for the police. When we got rid of the police targets in 2010, crime fell. And I think we would find that the standards in the NHS would rise if we loosen the grip from the centre.
But that does mean, at least in the short and medium term, pushing a lot of money towards the NHS, taking money away from other public services. How far do you think we should be willing to go with that?
Well, the NHS is, always going to cost a lot of money because we are living longer. And so the long-term demand for the NHS is going up by 3% a year. So I would expect funding for the NHS to go up at about the same level. But the truth is it's performing averagely. We want to have the best health service in the world, and that means making some really big reforms. And I want to see some evidence that the resources going into the NHS are not just going into huge pay awards for doctors, deserving though they are. I actually want to see them going into new computer systems that mean more efficient system, better services for patients, safer care.
Do you think we have seen evidence for that yet?
At the moment, what I've seen from this government is that they are pouring money into big public sector pay rises for their union backers, but I don't see that money going into the transformation of our public services, which is, I think, what taxpayers want to see.
The NHS was front and centre of David Cameron's campaign. It doesn't really feel like that's the case for Kemi Badenoch. Do you think that's fair? Do you think it should be more central when it comes to an election campaign?
I think it will be, but we're a long way from an election. I think she'll have a lot to say on that. But I think we haven't said very much on any policy area because we just had the worst defeat in our history. I think that the country probably wanted a period of silence from us, some contrition. But now, like all oppositions, we need to move to ideas and solutions. And I think there's a football pitch-sized gap in the market at the moment for a party coming up with solutions. With Nigel Farage's £80 billion of unfunded tax cuts, that's not a solution. That's just going to make things worse for the economy. And so that's really what the Conservatives need to do.
I do want to ask you a bit about what's happening in Israel. And we have the Israeli Security Minister and Finance Minister, two senior ministers being sanctioned today in the UK. Their assets frozen. They're going to be banned from entering the UK. I mean, that feels like a very significant moment. Do you think that was the right thing for the government to do?
Well, I think that broadly speaking, Britain does need to make its voice heard. I've just written a book called Can We Be Great Again, in which I explain that actually I think we have a lot more influence than we think. Israel's perhaps the country where it's most difficult to have influence. I'm not sure that the Prime Minister there listens to the American President, let alone the British Prime Minister. But, do I agree with some of the things that Israel has been doing in Gaza? As a long-term supporter of Israel, it pains me to say it, but I don't. And I do worry that they are losing moral authority by some of the actions they're taking.
And to show moral leadership, do you think we need to be prepared to see our relationship with Israel and potentially the US fracture?
Well, you have to judge this very carefully. This is the art of diplomacy, which again is one of the big themes I talk about. Sometimes you do things privately, sometimes you do things publicly. The risk of doing things too publicly is that you lose access. When it comes to the United States, I think Keir Starmer has done a good job in not provoking President Trump, even though I'm sure he disagrees with a number of things that he's said. So part of your job is to try and hold alliances together in very difficult situations.
Well, Jeremy Hunt there, the former Chancellor, talking to us. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Former TV presenter and Dr. David Bull is elected chairman of Reform UK after former chair Zia Youssef dramatically quit last week.
On the UK tonight at 8, we'll get the latest from Austria, where 10 people have been killed in a school shooting in the city of Graz. Also ahead, reaction as the UK sanctions 2 Israeli ministers, and we'll hear from the Southport families as they meet the Prime Minister in Downing Street. All that and much more on the UK tonight at 8 o'clock.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power. No freedom! Sky News, the full story first. There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. Free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in. Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, doctor and former presenter of Most Haunted Live, if you heard of that, David Bull, has been named as Reform UK's new chairman. He, of course, replaces Zia Youssef, who quit last week after criticising a colleague's call to ban the burqa before returning to the party in a different role 48 hours later. The new chairman, Mr Bull, told Sky's Sam Coates why he was the right man for the job.
I've known these chaps for a very long time, and that's what I meant by I have been living and breathing Reform UK for a very long time.
What do you think people most know you for?
That's a really interesting question. When this leaked last night, I think most people were absolutely thrilled I was taking over the role. I'm known for two things, probably. One is television, the other is politics.
Which bit of telly? Which programme?
It depends how old you are, is the honest answer to that, because obviously I did daytime, I've done prime time, so Tomorrow's World, News Round, I did years ago, Watchdog Health Check, Talk TV, so it just depends how old you are.
Do you think you can bring on board Rupert Murdoch?
Absolutely.
To back? How will you do that?
I haven't met Rupert, but obviously I've worked at Talk TV for 3 years. I'm a great proponent of everything that Talk does, News does as well. He is a man who sees common sense, and that is what this party brings, which is actually to turn around the country and make Britain great again.
Right, let's bring our panel, James Starkey and Kirsty Blackman, back in. What's going on with James? What's going on with reform? I mean, Zia, he was out, he's in. How damaging do you think that was?
Well, I mean, they've got a doctor as their current chairman. I think they're going too far down the Doctor Who line, where their chairman just regenerates at the end of every series. I think it's been a bit of a chaotic week for them. I thought today, you know, they've kind of seemed to. It was surprising that they got Zia back after, because if you look at his original tweet, which actually says it's not just that I'm resigning, but I don't think it's worth my time getting these people elected to government. So it was a rocky couple of days, which they seem to have kind of stemmed the flow of that today.
Do you think it matters, these sorts of, you know, problems at the top of a party?
So I think it does matter. I think, you know, looking at reform from where I'm sitting, they're very, very good at grabbing headlines, which is another thing they've managed to do. Maybe not the kind of headlines they would have liked in the past week. But
I guess, you know, does that matter? It's important to be able to grab headlines.
Yeah, it is, but you also need to do some work. And actually, they're never in the House of Commons. You know, they never seem to be there doing any actual work. So I would be wondering, you know, what is it their constituents are saying? What is it that people living in these reform councils are saying? Are they actually seeing that change that's being promised, or is this just a headline that is, you know, in the newspapers, that is on the news, and then doesn't actually follow through? So for me, I would be wondering, how are people's lives changing as a result of voting reform?
And on the kind of politics, why do people in Nigel Farage's parties resign, do you think?
I think, it's been a history. Look, it's built around Nigel Farage. But the simple truth is he is the person that's got them to where they are. So if you look at them pre-election, they were kind of hovering around 12-13%. With him, they wouldn't be anywhere near where they are without Nigel Farage. It does seem interesting that if you look at his history, he does have a history of falling out with people, but he kind of turns Zia around. So to Kirsty's point, if you look at the polling on Farage, a lot of people, even that support him, say, I don't know if he'd make a very good Prime Minister, right? So I think one of the issues they've got is they're a protest vote. If they want to be a party of government, they've got to show they're organised. And I do think Farage is learning in the way that he clearly put a big effort into knowing it doesn't look good if you can't run your own party, or can you really run a government? So they've clearly made a bigger effort than before, whereas I think he would have just said, OK, Zia, if you want to go, leave it. They've made an effort to bring him back in, look more orderly, so they can say, no, you can trust us, we do know how to run.
And he did say yesterday it needs to be more than just about Nigel Farage. Right, thank you both, Kirsty and James. What a wonderful panel you've been tonight. I will see you tomorrow at 7 o'clock for the full analysis of the spending review. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Jonathan Samuels, who I'm sure will have more on the news coming from the House of Commons.